If you were to ask a room of developers which is the easiest language to learn, HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, you'd pretty much get consensus that it would be HTML, right? You might have a couple of people trolling, especially if it was like an online poll or something saying that, maybe JavaScript is or something like that. But in general, I think everybody can agree that HTML is the easiest language. But it's kind of funny because I don't always feel that way. And I know I'm not alone. But a lot of the biggest struggles I have are actually figuring out the right markup for something. And I guess in a way, if we go back to the old ways that things were done, that can seem, it just wasn't like that, right? Like in the old days, everything was a div. And while that had its own issues, at least it's easy because you just knew you put a div and you'd be fine. Since we've had semantic elements, part of the reason for that is we're adding meaning to what we're putting things around. It's very important for things like accessibility. It adds to the document outline and all of that. But it also makes us have to think about the way things are actually being organized. And it can actually be really hard. I know Stephanie Eccles recently did an article a little bit on this idea of semantic HTML and how it's not always so straightforward. And in a way, it makes sense because semantics, it's the definition of language, and that's in itself such a weird and complicated topic when you think about it, and just the way that different people can interpret something, it falls into this, what should be a very straightforward thing. An example she gave, I think, in that article, which I'll put in the links in the description, was, I believe, like the block quote, and whether you should use a block quote or a figure with a fig caption, or should it be a block quote with any figure, right? And that's a really good question and something I've changed my approach with over time and will probably change again. And there doesn't seem to be like this one absolute solution, even for something like that, because it depends so much on context. And I recently shared an image on Twitter asking about this because I was putting together a demo for what was going to be a beginner-friendly video. And the purpose of the video is on grid. And I want to have some things in place first. And I was building out the rough draft for it. And I had this very typical layout type thing in there where we have sort of, they call them like an eyebrow or a kicker, where it's, I'm sure you've seen it when you have a card or something like that. And there's a main title, but above the main title, there's smaller text. And sometimes it's like a small, often it's all caps. And sometimes that's like your category. Or it could be something else, but it's sort of like this thing that leads you into the title itself. Very common in magazines and in the design world and print and stuff, and it's definitely found its way into web design as well. And I posted a picture of it. So it's just this card that has this little eyebrow/kicker thing at the top, and then like a size 16 font, and then the big title, and then a paragraph underneath and a button. And I asked people how they would mark things up. And actually, before I asked people, I actually looked it up. I did a quick Google search and I was trying to find some different things. And I found a few conversations where people were asking similar questions. And in their own threads, they were getting different replies, but it made sense because the context of theirs was a little bit different from mine. Because I've had these before where clearly the thing on top is like a category. And even though it's a size 16 and it's much smaller, I could easily justify that actually being the heading. And then the paragraph, or like the big thing that was underneath that has the big hierarchy, it's standing out, it's really visual. That, isn't necessarily the primary heading. The other one from, the breakdown of how our heading levels work, it made more sense. So that was one of the things that I actually saw come up. One of them was like an FAQ. So the little thing was the FAQ, and then there was the big thing that was the question. So like FAQ is the higher thing there, because that's the category or the section we're under type of thing. And then we had all the questions coming after that. So in a situation like that, it makes more sense for the FAQ to actually be, say, the H2 or maybe even an H1. And then each one of the really big things becomes an H2 because that sort of sets up the document outline. Whereas in my case, it didn't really work that way. It was more like, and I made the design myself, so part of it's for me to blame, but I was trying to follow sort of common design patterns that we see, and it looked better with the kicker there, which is why designers often put them there. And so I was trying to figure out what to do with it. And I was looking at it, and it's, it was just the title of it, and I'm not going to say what they are right now because it's not really important, but it wasn't really a category. It was sort of like almost like a subtitle, and the other one was the main title, but the subtitle's first and then the main title second. And when I asked, I got a lot of different replies and different ideas and different things coming up from the title at the top or the subtitle or whatever it is. The small text on top maybe should be a span and then the heading underneath. Maybe it should be that in the markup, the heading is like the big one was actually first, and then we use flex or grid to switch the order of them and just have the second one as a paragraph. There was some talk of it maybe being a link because it could link to, you click that and it goes to all of the different articles or whatever that have that same category. And then one that came up multiple times was using Hgroup. And Hgroup felt like the right thing for me because that's sort of what Hgroup is for. And if you don't know Hgroup, it's like heading group. And at one point, and I don't know the history and I don't want to be misquoted on this, but I believe at one point the idea with Hgroup is you could actually have multiple headings, and instead of creating a different sort of document outline and making subsections in the way that an H3 under an H2 would do, it would actually make the H3 act as a subtitle. But because no browsers actually implemented that to how it would change the document outline, we can't do it that way. And so the spec right now as it stands, because I did read it, says that it should be the Hgroup can have one heading in it and any number of paragraphs before or after it. And it could be 0 paragraphs before and after, or it could be as many as you want before with 0 after, or vice versa, where they only come after. And the paragraphs will sort of act as the subtitle, or not sort of. The idea is they do. But from a document outline perspective and a screen reader perspective, they don't actually do anything. So I was like, well, is there a purpose to using Hgroup then? And it led to a really interesting conversation, and there was some people commenting on it that have a lot of experience and were actually part of earlier drafts of the spec saying that you should use the role on it, but then the current one put a role equals group on there. But that's actually what the browsers are supposed to be doing yourself. And because of that, the spec actually says, don't do that. Don't add the role yourself, because that's the implied semantics of it. And generally speaking, if you have an element that has implied semantics, you're not supposed to put that same role on there. So if you have a button, you shouldn't put button and then role equals button, because it already is a button. Which makes me want to learn more on that side of things, of just like, what could the potential negative effects of that be? Is it just because we don't want to double something? But if it's already implied, is it going to be a negative if it's not implied? Anyway, it's something that I want to dive into more and read a lot more about and figure out, and actually have conversations with people who know a lot more about that than I do. And I'll definitely report back once I've figured those things out. But it was a really interesting discussion anyway. And I think I settled on, I'm going to use Hgroup for it, even though right now it's more that's the semantic meaning of it. It will group it that way. And even if it doesn't currently change anything from the document outline point of view or from how a screen reader will approach it, it's very possible that in the future that does actually work the way it's intended. And until then, it won't break anything. It just won't be as obvious that it's a subtitle. It will just read it as a paragraph. But that's probably better than the alternative. One thing, other solution that I didn't mention is also that sometimes the small text could be a span inside of the H1. And I think often we can actually do that. It just depends on when you look at it and how you're going to read it. So if the little text sort of flows and is part of the same sentence almost, and you could treat it as one sentence, then that could potentially be a solution too. But in this case, it definitely wasn't. But yeah, it was a very interesting thing, and it's something I wanted to talk about. And it's also, as you might notice, the return of the podcast. And I left this off to the end because, I wanted to dive into the topic itself. And I think this is more of what the podcast is going to be about. General musings that are on topic that I can talk about. And up until now, we haven't said anything that I've wanted to edit. So they will be generally very lightly edited. Hopefully, I don't do too much. I didn't script any of this. And we're going to see how it goes and all of that. So I do apologize if there's a few more ums and ahs. We'll see if those I can edit out without me having to find them myself. Some of the editing software these days can take care of that for you. So we'll see about that. Though I do want to say for the future of this podcast, the other thing that is going to happen is there will be some longer form content coming to them as well, because I have some interviews lined up. And my plan right now is to try and do one interview a month that I can put onto YouTube. But the YouTube version, I think I'm going to be trying to do it in a way that I can keep the interview to 20 minutes or shorter. And this podcast version that will be in this feed here will be probably hour-long discussions where it's includes the YouTube content, but also is like an extended cut where we get into sort of semi-tangential topics and less focused on one specific thing that I'll be keeping the YouTube content specific to. So yeah, you'll also notice if you were watching this on the YouTube version of this podcast, there's no video. I'm not going to record the video. I don't think I will. We'll see. Maybe I'll change my mind on that. But for now, no video, though I will be putting them on YouTube just in case anyone is listening to it through YouTube Music. And yeah, the reason I've sort of made part of this change is to be able to make the podcast happen again. And so something a little bit easier for me to produce, but also because of some feedback I got. A lot of people actually, I did the poll on my channel or my newsletter. I asked people what they thought of the current state of the podcast for people who had been listening to it. And a lot of people said they liked it as it was and to keep it the same. But there was complaints it was feedback that the same content between the newsletter and the podcast for them was kind of annoying, and I don't blame them, just because they wanted to consume both of them. I guess anything I'm doing, they want to consume, and I'm very humbled by that. I'm glad they want to do that. For me, the idea originally was that I wanted to sort of offer the same content in a different format for people who didn't want to read or who didn't want to listen to a podcast. And so that was the idea there. So now instead it will be more of, I have the general musings introductions to my newsletter. So this will be a similar topic, but the audio version will probably just be a little bit more in-depth, though I'm guessing I'm hitting about 12 minutes now. So I think in general, they'll probably be in the 10-ish minute range in terms of general length. This one's a little longer because I'm rambling on now about a few other things. But yeah, that is sort of, I wanted to give that update on what I'm doing. So that's sort of the general state of things. And I'm going to be trying to bring these back to being weekly released from now on. Every now and then, who knows, I might miss one. But yeah, I'd like them to be back. And that was an interesting discussion that I had there. If you want to participate in that discussion or have any thoughts on it, I think I'm also going to start a Discord thread on the topic itself to see what people think there and just have a place for the discussion. So I'll put a link to that discussion in the description or the show notes or whatever we call it for a podcast as well. And yeah, with that, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it. I hope that you're happy that I'm back in your ears in podcast form. If you have any feedback or anything else like that, please do just send me an email. It's hi@kevinpowell.co. If you have any suggestions or anything like that, just put podcast feedback or something like that in the subject line, and I'll make sure that I definitely check it out. And I think that's it. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you very much. And I guess until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.